Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Edwin Turner, who is a professor of astrophysical sciences at Princeton University. He also serves as co-chair of the NAOJ-Princeton Astrophysics Collaboration Council. He has carried out extensive astronomical observations at Mount Palomar Observatory, Kitt Peak National Observatory, NRAO's Very Large Array, Apache Point Observatory, the National Astronomical Observatory of Japan's Subaru telescope, and with the Hubble Space Telescope. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Sure. So I want to start with one of your earlier papers, and it's entitled Bayesian Analysis of the Astro-Biological Implications of Life's Early Emergence on Earth, in which you say life arose on Earth sometime in the first few 100 million years after the young planet had cooled to the point that it could support water-based organisms on its surface. The early emergence of life on Earth has been taken as evidence that the probability of abiogenesis is high if starting from young Earth-like conditions. Now, just to set the context, Ed, so the solar system about 5 billion years old, the Earth itself about 4.5 billion years old, and I guess we have some evidence that life originated around 3.8 billion years ago, something along those lines.
Yes, those numbers are all roughly correct. They're not absolutely certain, but the general consensus view is that, as you said, the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years old, but a rain of so-called heavy impacts, meaning objects, meteors, and asteroids and small objects in the early solar system, there was a much greater abundance of these objects still crashing into the planets and helping them form, probably heated and perhaps reheated the Earth's surface. These were huge impacts, depositing energy that was, millions of times like the energy of all the nuclear weapons that people have ever built,
Right.
and vaporize the ocean and probably sterilize the Earth if life had gotten started by that point. All of those statements you can look at slightly different scenarios. The evidence for them is not, I would say, incontrovertible, but that looks like the best we know.
Okay.
And that ended about 3.9 or to 3.8 billion years ago. So call it 3.9 billion years ago. Mm-hmm. And the earliest evidence of life that we have, as you say, goes back to about 3.8 billion years ago. It's fairly uncertain. It might have, there's, I think, uncontroversial evidence of about 3.5 billion years ago. Mm-hmm. So we don't know exactly when life got started, but of course, it got started earlier than our evidence. And in other words, the very first life must have appeared, long before, well, not long before, but before there was something that left a record of a fossil or a chemical signature
Yes.
that we can identify. So we don't know how early it started, but it was certainly within, say, a couple of 100 million years, and possibly much less than that.
Right. Yeah. So a few 100 million years, give or take. But that's very, very quick. So the puzzle that humans have been struggling with is one of it is the Fermi paradox. We haven't had any contact with any life outside, and anytime you compute probabilities based on a zero multiplied by infinity, it's quite difficult to difficult to understand. I don't think we understand infinity really well. Sometimes I wonder if you understand zero that well either. And so people say the possibilities are so high that life should be out there in pretty much anywhere you look, but we haven't found them. So this idea that life originated very quickly as soon as a planet cooled to a level that it can harbor water gives us some indication why we think that, right? How prevalent extraterrestrial life could be.
Yes, that's correct. It's as someone I think Charlie Lineweaver expressed it. It's like if you move to a new town and they have a lottery. You don't know anything about the odds, but you decide to buy a lottery ticket just to fit into your new community, and the very first one you buy is the winner. You might conclude from that the chances of winning this lottery are not so tiny, because you were lucky so quickly. Whereas if you had to live there for, you live there for 40 years buying a lottery ticket every day and then won, you might think, that the odds were quite a lot smaller. So it's a hint. The point of the paper you mentioned was to try to do a rigorous first principles Bayesian statistical analysis to try to determine exactly how much of a hint it is, or how strong of a hint it is that life arises easily.
Yeah, so let's get into the paper. And so there are a lot of puzzles, right? So there's the origination puzzle, and then there is the evolution puzzle, and all through the evolution there are some step function changes that makes it difficult to understand. But the origination puzzle is the biggest one, right, among all of them?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think all of the others are I don't know exactly what word to use, manageable, so to speak, but the discontinuity between the most complicated chemical systems we know that we would call non-living, and the simplest chemical systems that we would call life is just vast, enormous. It's an incredible change in complexity. And there's very little sign, there's not only not much time available for it to happen, as best we can make out from the origin of life on Earth, but there's also not any real traces of those intermediate steps that must have occurred very quickly, so we can't point at some chemical system and say, this is halfway there or 10% of the way there. And it's like we went from, from almost zero, from point in some measure of complexity from 0.00001 all the way up to one, like super quickly. And that sort of suggests that maybe life was just very lucky on Earth in one or more ways, either in one very improbable event or maybe a series of improbable events. But it sort of gives one the feeling that there's a big gap there. And so the paper that Dave Spiegel, my co-author and the first author of that paper, and I were trying to ask is, it turns out that Bayesian statistics gives you a mechanism, if you will, for, deriving exactly what the statistical implications of something like that are. And also into taking into account the very important issue of selection biases or selection effects. We have to exist, we could only be asking the question if we're on a world in which A, life got started, and B, got started early enough to leave time for, evolution to a level where we were thinking about such issues.
Right. So, so is RNA-based organisms sort of sit between life and non-life, right? So, is our hypothesis that that is the first thing that showed up?
Yes, that's there was very great excitement in the origin of life community of researchers around this hypothesis that came along, some decades back now, that in fact there might have been a whole RNA world, as it's called, a whole RNA form of life that preceded, the full DNA protein version we have now. So the idea is that the two main classes of molecules that that make up terrestrial life, that are the basis of terrestrial life, are the nucleic acids, of which there are two kinds, the DNA and RNA, and proteins. And, they involve a great deal of complexity. But so the idea is that maybe it's conceivable that the RNA world somehow functioned with just one kind of nucleic acid and no proteins and no DNA, and then that you made the transition to those. And people have been for a long time, so excited about this idea that I would say they have adopted it as, the code of conventional wisdom without a lot of strong evidence. Personally, I don't think it actually helps that much because the RNA world is already vastly complex. And so, it helps a little, but we're still talking about a huge transition. And as the chemist Stephen Benner has pointed out, you're kind of fooling yourself by saying that you're doing it all with RNA, because the parts of it, if you can have RNAs that are both self-catalytic, meaning they can, they can reproduce or copy themselves, and which have metabolic-like functions, but so they can do both the genetic function of DNA and the metabolic or functional things that proteins do. But as Benner pointed out, it's really different parts of a strand of RNA that do that. So you're really still doing both very complicated things and with different bits of chemistry, but you're then just plugging the two molecules together to make one big one.
Right.
But it's not really the case that you are doing both with the same thing. It's just different. It's like one of those things that's a fork and a spoon. What do they call them? Sporks or something. It's like you have different ends of it, so to speak, doing different things.
Yeah. So, I mean, so my understanding is that an RNA-based entity requires a cellular mechanism for reproduction, replication. So can we really imagine a world that is just RNA-based? I mean, how would they, unless they sort of de-evolved from what they used to be into to what we see today?
Well, I'm perhaps not the right person to speak for this view because I'm skeptical of it. But yes, I think it's very challenging. I mean, just to give one example, the RNA that's at the heart of a ribosome, which is often mentioned as the piece of strong evidence of a sort of fossil of the RNA world. What it actually does is make proteins, but the RNA world wasn't supposed to have proteins. I mean, so the fact that RNA can self-catalyze and can carry out some metabolic functions is very interesting, but it's still a very big leap to say that how a world we don't even perfectly understand how the biology, the molecular biology of the world we have works, much less be able to figure out how it would have worked on such a different basis. But there is some hope there, and but it's difficult. Single RNA strands are very fragile, and in fact, another point due to Stephen Benner is that the most common functional thing an RNA molecule can do, if you make random ones in the lab, the most common process they carry out is to cut other RNA molecules into pieces. They cleave. So if you're not careful and you evolve an RNA world, it will be self-limiting. It will be full of RNA molecules that cut each other to pieces, basically, that break each other up and prevent the formation of much more complicated molecules.
Right.
So there's some hope there, but I think it's a little bit, it feels to me a little bit like grasping at straws. Not impossible, but not a sure bet.
So what's the hypothesis that you prefer? So, you could think about a lot of different things. You could think about RNA sort of a waste product of the DNA evolution. It could be RNA, DNA-based organisms co-evolving. So what's the hypothesis that you prefer or you think is most likely?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer to that question that you probably won't like. Or at least won't be very interesting to your listeners, which is simply to say that my experience in science is it's much better if you can avoid having a preferred answer to an important question in the absence of strong, compelling evidence. And Richard Feynman used to say, that the most important thing to science is not to be fooled, not to fool people, and the person that's easiest to fool is yourself. So I really think that the answer is we don't know, and there's not strong evidence either way. And people who work a lot in a field, most of my life I was a cosmologist, most of my career, I should say, the vast majority of my publications have been in the area of cosmology, and cosmology is a similar problem in the sense, field, not problem, a similar field in the sense that there, are very big, important questions, and through most of my life, not very strong evidence, and people would become very committed to one answer or another and write a lot of papers about it. So I really have an open mind, and or try to anyway, and don't. But I think the conclusion that the paper that Dave Spiegel and I wrote, what I believe is that the early emergence of life on Earth is a hint that life gets started easily. That's sort of the best guess. But it doesn't, in some way, we don't know that it, that in a way that probably implies a lot of extraterrestrial life in the universe, at least simple life. Hard to say about more complex life. But I think it also does not rule out, and this is the way in which the paper made a conclusion which was contrary to I don't know if you would say conventional wisdom, but many people in the field's opinion. It doesn't actually rule out the chance that the event that started life on Earth was some extremely rare statistical event, including something so rare that it would imply no other life in the observable universe, out to the light travel time since the Big Bang. I think at the end of our paper, we had some sentence that said something like, an enthusiast of extraterrestrial life should be encouraged, but not convinced or something, or not secure. So I think the earlier appearance of life has weaker implications than many people had thought. That was the sort of, one-line conclusion from the paper that I would hold to.
So the Bayesian statistical framework you applied, essentially, it's indicating that it is realistic to assume that the probability of life evolving is really small, even if you multiply that with a very, very large number, not infinity, but very, very large number. You still you could come out with a very, very small number in terms of how many life forms might be out there.
Right. It just if your hypothesis was that this huge step in complexity, which we talked about, and between the non-living and living chemical systems, was just due to some crazy improbable fluke that happened to happen on the Earth, just something that like monkeys typing monkeys banging on a keyboard randomly, writing a Shakespearean sonnet or something, those sort of things, a random combinatorial event that, would occur in 10 to the minus some big number of times you had the chance to do it. That hypothesis is not ruled out. Now, many people that read the paper believe that I and Dave and I think that that's the correct answer. At least for me, I wouldn't try to speak for him. That's not the case. It's not that I'm convinced that there was a rare statistical fluke. I'm just convinced that we have no way of ruling that out.
Our ideas are getting a bit clouded, I guess, when we think about once we have that happen, that the first accident happen, then we can see the plethora of directions it went. Yes. Right. The world is teeming with all sorts of life. That maybe that is noise that doesn't give us clarity for time equal to zero type question. But it's also some indication, right, Ed, that I sometimes think of this as there has to be a physics basics for life, some sort of a thermodynamics based idea that entropy is always increasing. Maybe life is a way to accelerate increase of entropy or something along those lines. And if there is a physics basis for it, then it has to happen everywhere, pretty much.
Yes, that's an interesting hypothesis, and one that I've occasionally talked about. I haven't published on, but as you know, the second law of thermodynamics says that disorder has to increase in an finite enclosed system. And life does exactly the opposite. It has order increasing, it has entropy decreasing in a restricted area of a system, whereas it can't violate the second law. Nothing can, basically. So what happens with life is when life forms or operates, lives, metabolism occurs, you have some small isolated part of the system, the creature itself, let's call it, or the cell, in which entropy is decreasing and order is increasing at the expense of causing decreased entropy and increased disorder outside it. Now, that clearly is what's going on, and you can see it going on in scales that have nothing to do with life. The formation of galaxies in the solar system out of interstellar, first intergalactic material and interstellar period also does that. It produces greater order in a small area and more disorder in a large area. And one could imagine there's a sort of fourth law of thermodynamics in which says that there, under some conditions, might be mathematical conditions, might be conditions on the laws of physics, that there's a natural tendency for entropy, while the total entropy is increasing, the distribution of entropy in different parts of the system might be spreading. So the difference between the most disordered and the least disordered, or most ordered and most disordered parts of the system, might increase as a function of time, and that would suggest that life is a consequence of this sort of thermodynamic law. That would be very exciting type of, and if I were a better physicist, I would try to come up with some proof of that, but that's kind of beyond me. But that's one way of reading it. Yes, that's a possibility that would kind of bridge the oh my gosh, it just looks magical kind of reaction to life.
Yeah. And if that's the case, then one could imagine it is a universal law. So wherever we look, there has to be potentially life. But again, that takes us back to sort of the Fermi paradox question. We don't really see yet, at least intelligent life. It might be that it takes more time. But I also want to ask you, Ed, so in the universe, we see galaxies, we see star systems, and so there is order in small volumes at the expense of disorder elsewhere. But we don't see that that is driven by gravity fundamentally, right? But we don't see that happening in small spaces, like a room, filled with gas or something like
right. That's certainly true, and means that, well, first of all, it may mean there's no such fourth law of thermodynamics, and all of that's just, so much whistling in the dark guessing. But
yeah.
It would also imply that this tendency to form greater order on smaller scales must only apply under certain conditions, which don't seem to apply in the distribution of air molecules in the room and stuff. That it clearly doesn't, I guess, or at least if it does, it doesn't happen very rapidly. And could only really occur by one of these highly improbable statistical things. There's no law or fourth law of thermodynamics or something driving it that way. So that's evidence against that. You mentioned the Fermi paradox a couple of times. I should add that one of the advantages of the theory that life appeared by one of these incredibly rare statistical fluctuations is that it's refutable.
Yeah, there is no paradox.
It could,
yeah.
If we find other life in the universe, other outside the Earth, that will instantly tell us that it probably wasn't one of these incredibly rare statistical fluctuations. So as a model of how life started, unlike most of them, it's a hypothesis that can be tested and rejected. Falsifiable.
Yeah, so
falsifiable was the word I was searching for.
Yeah, so it's a sort of a clean break if we can find something. But till we find something, we are sort of in a limbo. I just want to touch back on gravity one more time. So life, components of life is much heavier than, let me ask you, they are much heavier than molecules and atoms. So do we, is it possible that gravity is playing a role in the formation of life?
I don't think it's at all plausible that gravitational forces operating on the scale of molecules, the forces are so tiny compared to everything else involved, were what pulled living molecules together. However, the source of free energy that the primary source of free energy in biology on Earth comes, of course, from sunlight and or from the decay of radioactive elements that were formed in the centers of stars. So the expenditure of what's called Gibbs free energy, or just free energy in thermodynamic terms, that is required to decrease entropy in a small volume. That energy comes ultimately from gravitational sources. And gravity does this due to the fact that it has a negative specific heat. That is to say, when you put energy into a system that's dominated by gravity, it gets colder instead of hotter.
And so I don't know if it is extensible this way. A lot of the experiments of sort of recreating life started sort of at the atomic and molecular level. I wondered if you take it one step further into a point that some of these other forces could become more interesting to look at. Do we have experiments that starts not at the initial conditions with nothing, but rather initial conditions a little bit further up in terms of progression?
Well, yes, in a way. There's certainly a lot of molecular biology that's done, not so much from the point of view, as far as I know, of recreating life, but of doing producing designer proteins and pharmaceuticals and doing genetic modifications of creatures, crops, and also other creatures those don't start down at the individual atomic and molecular level. They start by, manipulating already incredibly complex existing molecular biology machinery.
Right.
Sort of one more thought that I have to attribute to Stephen Benner is that when something dies, when a cell dies, it's full of major pieces of the molecular apparatus of life. It's all of those proteins and nucleic acids that were doing things start breaking up and falling into pieces and being oxidized and so on. But if you look not too long after it died, it's sort of, it's like your child built some elaborate thing out of Legos and has now broken it into, not down into the basic Legos, but into, the pirate ship or farm or whatever it was, is now in 5 or 6 different pieces, which makes it pretty easy to put it back together. But what we don't see is things coming back to life, dead cells, finding some way to use the fact that they already have what you described, I think, as a rather higher level of organization to start from. That doesn't seem to happen. So that's a little discouraging, I would say, from the point of how easy it is to get from sort of, up that last step from sort of just sub-life levels up to the life level.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So we are sort of still stuck in trying to figure out. Your paper seems to at least says that it is okay. We could have an outcome that the probability of life originating is very low. And if that's the case, Fermi paradox is not a paradox at all. So till we find something outside, that still seems to be sort of the dominant position we can take, right? Is there anything else we could?
You mean some other position to explain the Fermi paradox other than the universe just being dead?
Paradox, or even, I mean, so if somebody were to ask today, is there life out there? The answer has to be that it is unlikely.
Well, people's opinions on that differ a great deal. It's to put it mildly, and it's very hard to prove that something isn't there. Like if I ask you to prove that there are no unicorns on Earth, well, there's never been a there's not a unicorn in the room. There's not a unicorn, where we've looked and so on, or whatever. It's just, and our capacity to date to search the universe is so incredibly limited. It would be sort of like if I said, well, here on the surface of my desk, I don't see any ant. I don't see an ant. There must not be any ant anywhere in the world. So there's a huge extrapolation there. But in a very general way, I would say the Fermi paradox could indicate that life is absent. It could indicate that life is just a lot less conspicuous and more low profile than the Fermi scenario envisions. It could be that there's a sort of limiting technology somewhere that we haven't hit that would be impossible for life to spread. Life could be quite rare. Maybe there's one technical civilization per billion years per galaxy. That would still be a lot in the universe. But the chance it would have gotten here might be quite small, or the chance we could see signs of it. But it does seem to argue against the universe like really teeming with life. I mean, if you want me to make enemies of some of my colleagues, the SETI enterprise where we're looking for radio signals from advanced civilizations, for that to have any significant chance of success, there has to be quite a lot of civilizations out there with quite advanced technologies who are similar enough to ourselves that, they're broadcasting signals we could pick up and so on. That level, that scenario feels to me pretty unlikely, because it seems like if there were enough to give the SETI people a chance, we would have probably bumped into them in a more Fermi sense.
Right. Right. And the issue there, of course, is the space-time corridor we can explore is so thin that it's analogous to your finding the ant on your desk in a universe the size of the world, and so that's a complication. We'll take a quick break, Ed. When we come back, we'll talk about the extraterrestrial planets. Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. So Ed, I want to go into a couple of your other papers. This is sort of looking at using data that we typically don't use, I guess, to think about life in extraterrestrial planets. So the first one is entitled "Vegetation's Red Edge: A Possible Spectroscopic Biosignature of Extraterrestrial Plants." And you say Earth's plants have a sharp order of magnitude increase in leaf reflectance between approximately 700 and 750 millimeters of wavelength.
Not millimeters. Should be.
Oh, nanometers. Sorry, that'll be a big wave. Yeah, 700 and 750 nanometers of wavelength. And the strong reflectance of Earth's vegetation suggests that surface biosignatures with sharp spectral features might be detectable. So, as far as I know, Ed, the basic idea is that we're looking for planets, we're looking for Earth-sized planets, we're looking for sort of terrestrial planets. We're looking for them in what is called the habitable zone, so that it can have water. And then we take a leap forward to say, if you have Earth-like planet having water, there is a high likelihood there could be life there. But you're suggesting here perhaps we can use other type of data, right? So if those planets out there in other solar systems had plants, we could potentially measure something.
Right, and like so many things in astrobiology, this is based on, I guess maybe hope or assumption would be the right words, that extraterrestrial life might resemble terrestrial life, because and people outside the field of astrobiology often complain that we're that life could be very different, and we're too much depending on the assumption that the life we know is typical. Absolutely a great point, and certainly true. And I think astrobiologists are sort of in the position of someone, I don't know, trying to learn about dogs and write a book about dogs and what dogs are like. But they've only ever seen one dog. They have one dog, but they have no way of knowing, whether all dogs are that size and that color, and whether they all wag their tails, and whether they all like to eat the same things, or whether they're all named Spot, or whatever.
Right.
And yet, without any other information, it's about the best we can do. So the idea, yes, is to imagine that a feature which is a very strong indicator of plant life, a very strong signature, let's say, of plant life, which was discovered, I think more than a century ago. It's in our paper. I've forgotten the history, but discovered on Earth, but also seen from space on the Earth, is that the fraction of the light that is reflected by a leaf of a plant that grows in the temperate zone, a deciduous plant, that's a plant that loses its leaves annually, goes from up by a factor of 10 or more on a very narrow range of wavelengths for good biological reasons that have to do with the nature of photosynthesis and the pigments that capture radiated energy and turn it into chemical energy that the plants use, and of course that feeding off of plants and things that animal life uses on Earth. It's a very, very important.
So this is something that they're not using for photosynthesis, so it goes back?
Yes, that's right. And they can't use it for photosynthesis. And it's actually, well, let me explain a little bit. Photosynthesis involves plants using photochemical transitions in pigments, meaning that a chemical goes from one energy state to another by absorbing a photon. And so you capture that little bit of solar energy and store it in a chemical form that is then, through a very complicated series of reactions, transformed into sugars and eventually ADT and the energy used by living things.
Yeah.
But like all quantum transitions, including photochemical ones, there's a minimum energy the photon has to make that transition. It's like picking the molecule up and moving it into a higher energy state by a certain fixed delta, a certain fixed amount. And if the photon doesn't have that much energy, it just can't do it. Right. So the photons on the long wavelength, shorter wavelength photons have more energy. So on the long wavelength side of this minimum energy, the lower photons lower energy than this minimum energy, which corresponds to the wavelength of the red edge, simply aren't useful for photosynthesis, but they can heat the plant. And at temperate zone temperatures, like we have in, most of the planet, but not the polar, not really cold places, the efficiency of photosynthesis, the fraction of the energy they absorb that they can change into the chemical form, goes down as the temperature goes up pretty steeply. So the plants really don't want that energy. They don't want to be warmed up. And plants in the temperate zone do lots of things to keep cool. They sweat. They have big flat leaves that can radiate away the energy. And through a variety, they actually move energy through them by very slow circulation of fluids and things. So they're all about keeping cool. And so they want to reflect this. And if they don't, the photons in this range that aren't reflected mostly pass through these big flat leaves. So if you look at something at a little shorter wavelength, very far red but not infrared energies that strike a plant, like 95% of it or 90% of it or so is getting perhaps absorbed, the rest reflected. But if you go, just a little bit, 5-10% further into the infrared, just beyond where humans can see, then the plant is maybe absorbing 5% instead of 95%. It's either reflecting it or letting it pass through. So it's a very strong rejection of those photons. And it serves that biological purpose of helping keep the plants cool. Plants that are coniferous plants that live in cold regions where they need to avoid freezing don't have this behavior, and their leaves aren't flat. They're like needles. They're doing the opposite. They're trying to keep warm. So it is an evolutionary adaptation, it appears, to to the sort of biochemistry of photosynthesis. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. No. So the wavelength itself could be a feature of Earth's plants, right? And so if you were to look for this, it's not necessary that we get 700, 750 nanometer reflection. We may get a reflection at some wavelength. Presumably, the extraterrestrial plant could have different features, right?
Yes, and here we wade into the uncertainties of whether extraterrestrial, how closely it would resemble life on Earth. The reason that the wavelength is where it is is because the pigments that plants employ to capture the photons, that pigment in this case is just a word for the chemicals that capture these photons. The photosynthesis depends on a bunch of different pigments, actually. And in fact, the whole reason that plants look green to our eyes is there's sort of a crack between the pigments that absorb light that's bluer, to the shorter wavelength, bluer side of green, and the pigments that absorb light to the redder side of green light at about 550 nanometers. So the extra light that leaks through there is what makes plants look green to us. It's still very much less than the red edge, but yes, in principle, if extraterrestrial plants had pigments, evolved pigments that could capture additional photons that say went out to 800, let's say, nanometers, then they might have an edge there. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
The one argument against it is that it would be a big energetic advantage for a plant on Earth to be able to hook into that extra energy. There's a lot of extra energy out there. And so, in the hundreds of millions of years that we have had land vegetation on Earth, or for that matter, and even longer in the sea, plankton and stuff, billions of years, evolution has not found a more pigment that is helpful in going out into that regime. So, but we don't even know that chlorophyll, this is all based on chlorophyll-driven photosynthesis, for all we know, on a different planet. There could be some very different form of photosynthesis, but if we see an edge at the position of Earth's red edge, that to me will be very strongly suggestive. And if we see an edge somewhere else, that will be less compelling, but still very, very interesting.
So if we look back, if we go up and look back to Earth, we will clearly see this.
Yes, we have seen it. In fact, in the light coming off the Earth, I think Carl Sagan led a group in reflected light off of forests, as seen from, I believe, the Galileo or some space probe that was doing a gravity assist off of the Earth, and flew quite close to the Earth, and they had pointed the cameras down and looked at forests, and I want to say Australia, but I'm not sure now, I recall, and saw this red edge that is pointing your detector directly at plants are there. There's also the question of whether you would see it if we are observing an exoplanet, we're not going to see different parts of the planet in the foreseeable future. I would guess it'll be a very long time, but we would see the light coming from the whole planet. So there's a question of whether the red edge would show up in the light of the Earth, seen as a whole, like a alien astrobiologist might look at our solar system. And you can actually test that by observing the light of the Earth reflected off the dark side of the moon, the so-called Earth shine. If you look at a crescent moon, you can often see a faint illumination of the night side of the moon. And by analyzing that light, you can detect the red edge, and that has been done by a number of groups, including there was some spectra that we published in, I think, a paper you referred to, where we looked at the moon when someone standing on the dark side of the moon would have looked down on the Earth and seen, South America basically in the middle of the terrestrial disk, which has lots and lots of plants. And then we later observed at a time when someone on the dark side of the, in the night side of the moon, if they'd looked at the Earth, would have seen mostly the Pacific Ocean, which doesn't, of course, have a lot of forests. And and you can see the difference in the red light. So, in fact, as the Earth rotates, a distant observer would, so to speak, see it flashing red off and on as different areas of the planet came into view.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering, with advances in artificial intelligence, if we take the Earth's pattern of the entire spectrum, and then use that as to sort of assign a probability that there's something out there, seems like it's something that we could do in the future.
Yes, there's actually, I mean, not so much at this point, at least, I don't think. I mean, right now, artificial intelligence is in a boom phase and being applied to all sorts of problems. But even aside from any AI approaches, for around 20 years now, NASA has had a sort of, it's part of its long-term research plan. They have sort of scientific agendas and roadmaps. They usually refer to them as scientific roadmaps going a few decades into the future, partly because missions take so long to plan and engineer and develop and so on, often take decades. An idea for a mission, which was, at least originally, I think it's had different names, but it's called Terrestrial Planet Finder. But the idea was exactly that, is to build space, to have telescopes in space that would be designed to search for things like the red edge, but also, and maybe even more, sort of more straightforward and more technologically, I think, less challenging, but still very challenging, would be to get spectra of the planet's atmosphere and see if it contained oxygen, for example, which, of course, in the Earth's atmosphere is produced by the respiration of plants, and also to look for water vapor, large amounts of water vapor and variable amounts of water vapor in the atmosphere would suggest the presence of, large bodies of water on the surface, and perhaps of weather, that rain and, precipitation that takes water out of the atmosphere, and evaporation that puts it into the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. So there's, thick documents and major studies. In fact, it's how I personally got involved in some of this stuff, was working on some NASA study of how one might do this. So yes, I'm not sure it will occur. Probably, well, most certainly won't occur during my professional lifetime, and maybe not in my mortal lifetime. But I think in the lifetimes of many of your listeners, we will certainly have. We certainly plan to have missions that would have at least some chance of looking for these biosignatures, as they're called, on extrasolar planets.
Yeah. You have another paper along the same lines, Ed, which is, if I understand this correctly, again, looking for photometric variability. So if you have large water bodies and the planet is rotating, that again should create some detection patterns for us, right?
Yes, I've had a lot of fun with that idea, which is simply the fact that if we are able to see an extrasolar Earth, let's say, fairly near the solar system, let's say within 10 parsecs, which is like 32 or something light years, sort of an arbitrary distance, but it's in that distance there's a couple of hundred more or less sun-like stars. So it's sort of become a canonical initial volume of the universe we would like to aspire to being able to search. So if you put the Earth at that distance, it's extremely faint. It's about as faint as the faintest object the Hubble Space Telescope has ever seen in its longest exposures, which are a couple of weeks, a week or two. So it's not too faint for us to see, but it's damn close to being too faint for us to see, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it's also parked right next to the star that it's orbiting, if it's in the habitable zone, making it yet more difficult because of the glare. So there's a lot of technology involved in how you might be able to look at it. But anyway, if we ever do see it, what we will have is all of the complexity represented by the Earth. Imagine one of the beautiful pictures of the Earth taken, by space probes or astronauts on on their way to the moon and that sort of thing. But now it's just reduced into a tiny point of light you can barely see, with no detail. So that's discouraging in a way, especially if you're a science fiction. If you would go to the movies and see the spacecraft, or the Star Trek or whatever, it's zooming in over these beautiful planets and seeing all their details. But it turns out that we have a little access to that by just looking at the variations in the brightness of such a planet as it rotates. And once again, it's to our advantage, or, it's helpful to imagine what it would look like if we saw the Earth rotating. And I already alluded to that, or we already talked about it a little in the context of the red edge, because sometimes you'd be seeing a lot of plants would be, and, if you're looking at a landmass with heavy foliage, and other times you wouldn't be seeing much if you're looking at an ocean or something. Was where most of the reflected light was coming from. One thing we found out, and is in the paper you mentioned, is that a remarkably small fraction of a planet's surface at any given moment is producing a large fraction of the reflected light that you, or scattered light, more technically correct, that you're seeing. Something like 80% of the light comes from about 10% of the surface of the Earth, for a hypothetical alien telescope looking at it. So as the Earth rotates, that 10% changes, and so the brightness of the planet will change. And while it's very hard to study one of these very tiny, faint little points of light, measuring its brightness is maybe, and variations in its brightness, and averaging those over a number of rotations to beat down the noise and so on, is, we think, one of the more practical things we can do. And as the planet changes in color and brightness and so on, by changes in color, I mean the brightness in different wavelength ranges changes differently. You get some information on the surface. And at the time we wrote the paper you mentioned, which was written by Eric Ford and Sarah Seeger and myself, back around 2000, I think that's the paper you're referring to.
The reflectivity,
right. Oh, yeah.
The light change.
Yes, people didn't realize there would be such large variations and so on. But we had fun with so we made computer calculations. What I was going to say is we had a lot of fun trying out changing the Earth in various ways and seeing how much difference it made to the brightness. So we made sort of different Star Wars planets. We made Tatooine, the desert planet, by making a model of the Earth with no plants, just desert, and Dagobah, the jungle planet, by covering the whole landmass with vegetation, and Hoth, the ice world, by assuming everything was covered with ice and so on, all the land masses. And the not very surprising conclusion was that if you make big qualitative changes in the properties of the surface of the planet, you make big qualitative changes in its light curve. So it is encoding information. And much later work by a variety of people, including Yuko Fuji, now at the National Astronomical Observatory of Japan, showed that, which I must say, skeptical of at first, that you could actually somewhat retrieve that information, do what's called the inverse problem, take realistic looking data with actual noise and all the sort of problems that real data have, and back out of it at least a rough indication of how much of the planet's surface was covered with water versus ice versus vegetation if it had a red edge. And all of this is assuming, that they're similar property, that the planet's surface is not made out of crystals or something. It's somewhat similar to the Earth's surface. And you can learn a lot of things, including where coastlines are and stuff.
So practically speaking, though, Ed, this has to be sort of 10 parsecs, 30 light years sort of distance, right, for us to observe these things?
Well, in principle, if you have perfect instruments and big enough telescopes, it wouldn't have to be that close. But
okay.
Yes, that's already, it's already very hard. And it gets harder in two different ways if you wanted to go out to a larger distance. One is that the planet goes, of course, fainter, like the inverse square of the distance. So if you wanted to look twice as far, it's 4 times fainter. But maybe even more seriously, the separation in the sky, the angle between the very bright star and the very faint planet, the glare problem or the dynamic range problem, as it's more properly called, gets harder and harder by. So if you're looking at a system that's twice as far away, that separation is half as big. It goes, inversely rather than inverse square. But the combination of those two is for any given capability of an observing system that you might have, there's going to be a pretty hard limit on how far you can look. And, if we're really lucky and to find an Earth-like planet in the habitable zone of a sun-like star, that's among the nearest sun-like stars instead of among the nearest few hundred, if it's like the 5th nearest one or something, then things get a lot easier and we can do all of this much better with the same system or do it, with a smaller and less expensive system. So,
So intuitively, at least, the SETI experiment looking for electronic signals, and we already talked about how unlikely that might be.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I can edit this out. It's not a problem. So what I was saying was that the SETI experiment, looking for electronic sort of signals, and we already talked about how unlikely that is going to be for a variety of reasons. At least intuitively, it seems to me that these types of observations, if you take a sweep of 30 light years or so away from the Earth, you take a sweep of that, and I don't know how many planets, Earth-like planets, you might find in that sphere. But assuming you find a number, and you take this measurements, and we find that there is nothing there in that sphere that has that has anything like this. It is sort of the next data point, right? That tells us at least it's very difficult to find intelligent life, but it's a lot easier to find potentially life in this fashion.
Yes, I think so. One of the little digs that some of my colleagues I occasionally make in the past this was newer research and I was presenting it in colloquia and things, is that the SETI people often say with the, I would say the characteristic arrogance of our species, that the strongest indication of life on Earth is the radio signals we have been, and radar signals we've been sending out. But
that just happened last 100 years. We've been around
right,
4 billion.
Exactly. We're pathetic compared to the trees, the least intelligent things, plants, the least intelligent creatures on the Earth, have been sending out vastly more powerful signals, not intentionally, of course, but for hundreds of millions of years, and compared to exactly as you said, 100 years. One of the problems with finding intelligent life is, even if it's common, if it doesn't last a really long time, we'll have a hard time. It won't be here, won't be there when we're looking, even if it was before or will be later. So I'm pretty pessimistic about SETI personally. That said, I definitely support doing research, because you shouldn't. Science is all about finding out you're wrong by actually doing experiments. So I all in favor of continuing the SETI enterprise and looking, because if it were to succeed, it's one of these asymmetric consequence sort of calculations. Not seeing something tells us very little. Seeing something would be incredible and enormous impact. So even if it's it's buying a lottery ticket, the way I look at it. This is the second time lottery tickets have come up in our conversation. But, almost certainly you're going to lose, but if you win, it'll change your life. And that's SETI to me.
Yeah, I mean, the pessimism for me is just the space-time constraints on it. So the signal has to arrive here precisely at the time that we're looking for it. And, it's a bit like to coordinate that, the probability of that happening, even if there are a lot of planets out there with life, it has to arrive here precisely when we're looking for it. And from the direction we're looking and in the frequency or way we're looking in things, there's lots of ways we could be missing each other. The Fermi paradox, of course, is based on the conclusion that interstellar travel would be easy enough for life to and spread if there's a lot of it, and that, of course, could be the case or it might not. But yeah, I mean, the other philosophical question is, if you have really evolved life form, will they have any incentive to show themselves? My intuition is that they wouldn't. And so we are little microbes here looking for some intelligent life form, and they have no intention of ever making a communication.
Yes, I mean, that is, there's a whole book, which unfortunately neither the title nor the author of I can remember, about possible resolutions of the Fermi paradox, which isn't really a paradox, of course, but that's one of them, is that they're just indifferent or whatever. There's an amusing sort of science fiction speculation that we suddenly get these incredibly interesting looking powerful signals from the sky, and after we investigate, we discover that it's the third grade science project of some that the civilization itself isn't really interested, but some quirky alien decided it might be fun or something like that, but sort of like pointing the ants or something. But anyway, yes, but we're profoundly ignorant about all of this, and while I think it's a lot of fun and I enjoy actually myself, trying to speculate about these things and so on, I think it's, as I said, when you asked me what my preferred hypothesis for the origin of life was, I think it's really important not to have a preferred hypothesis when you don't know, and I'd say we don't know.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Ed. Thanks so much for spending time with me. And
it was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope whoever hears it will find it of some interest.
Thanks so much.
You too.
Stay safe. Okay. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.